Hello, St. Matthew's United Methodist Church, and those of you who are joining us online. I mean, they're all technically online, right?
They all are. Yes.
I'm Pastor
Nobody's
Kelly.
here in the room with us, and I'm Pastor Dave.
And we've started Holy Week. Yay! It's the love Holy Week. But really excited to talk with y'all. We've all kind of walked through Lent together. That's kind of what we've been doing on the podcast. And then now it's the final week. But we started yesterday. Dave, you preached a great message on Palm Sunday and the triumphant entry of Jesus. And so today we're going to talk about Palm Sunday. We're going to talk about Monday. It's like Monday, but an on. Just kidding. Monday, Thursday, and Good Friday. Not Easter. That's next week. And we want to talk a little bit about those, not in super great detail, but just kind of on the topic of Holy Week. I caught myself. I didn't use my catchphrase. But Dave, so you preached yesterday on Palm Sunday. Kind of walk us through that a little bit.
We're going to turn the lamp on first.
I should probably do that. Hey, Jesus is here too. Yay.
Oh, very good. Okay, so Palm Sunday is one of those passages that you really have to kind of know what's going on.
Sure.
Yeah, outside of, really, it helps you to understand what's going on outside of what's written in the Scripture. You know, the context of the setting is super important, I think, for this message. So in the triumphal entry is Jesus coming into Jerusalem. Jerusalem, capital city of Israel. Israel under occupation of Rome. So Rome has occupied the country, and we can look to any kind of country that is occupied today and kind of get an idea of what that meant for them, right?
Yeah.
We could look at Ukraine or any of those other kind of countries that are dealing with that, and understand that is overshadowing all of the Holy Week passages, but then really all of the gospel, because it's occupied throughout all of the New Testament.
It's going to be a pretty consistent theme throughout the entirety of Scripture. They're just occupied by somebody else.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and that plays into the message.
Right.
I mean, that is
100%.
in part of what is being reacted to and the messages that are being given, for sure. So it's always kind of part of the underlying, message or the context. But for Holy Week, I think it really comes into play and becomes really important to the story. So we think about Jerusalem as occupied by Rome. There's a garrison of Roman soldiers who were there all the time. Jerusalem's about 40,000 people, the population. And Jesus comes in during Passover week. So it's the festival of Passover, one of the big Jewish holidays. And people come into the city. It's where the temple is. It's where kind of the center of the universe is for the Jewish people at the time. And so the city swells to about 200,000 people in this time. So Roman occupiers trying to keep the peace, euphemism for, keep the country under control.
Right.
And so, the Roman kind of government has anxiety that they don't normally have. They have an extra burden. Part of what is happening is more troops are coming in, more Roman troops are coming in to deal with the big, massive influx of peoples, the population there. And it's in this setting that Jesus comes into the city. And Jesus is using or fulfills all of the kind of messianic kind of symbols. What is said is going to happen when the Messiah comes. The Messiah is going to come and rescue the people from all of their plights. And so the people of this time have defined that as the Messiah is going to come and it's going to overthrow the Roman government.
Sure.
Going to overthrow these occupiers. And what's interesting is this is the week of Passover, which celebrates the Jewish people's kind of liberation from another empire, the empire of Egypt, 1,000 years earlier. And so it's, that's part of the story too. God is the one who frees the oppressed. who liberates the slaves, who brings freedom and joy to a downtrodden people.
Yep.
Kind of story. And then there's proof and celebration of it happening in Egypt. And so everybody's kind of got that in their mind as they're under Roman occupation.
Right.
Jesus comes in as with all of these messianic symbols, the colt, the donkey coming in from the east, and there's other things there. And so the people greet Jesus with hosannas, which is a praise that really begins as "Save us." And so that's the beginning of that's the triumphal entry.
Yeah.
But then also kind of explains why toward the end of the week the people stop shouting Hosanna. They stop saying "Save us," and the crowds, their voice and the thing they chant changes to "Crucify him," because Jesus didn't come to stand toe to toe with the Roman army,
right,
at the time. Is not leading an army that's going to liberate in the way that people want to be liberated, the country or the city of Jerusalem.
Right.
So that's all important stuff to know as we kind of examine this Palm Sunday narrative and story. Is that political piece of it is really the bulk of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think other things that are really important to point out as well, right? So number one, a narrative that I'm really exhausted hearing is, why didn't they get it? They should have gotten it. And I'm like, nah, I mean, there's a consistent pattern here of, so Passover is with Egypt, but after the Exodus of Egypt, this happens consistently where the Jewish people are oppressed and enslaved to another foreign people group that occupy them and take over and treat them really terribly. And then God hears their cries and they're repentant. And then a judge gets appointed. And then that judge militarily and more often than not violently overthrows said oppressor. And then I joke, I call it the clock. And then the clock starts again and then it happens again. And there is a pattern here from their own history where this seems to be the way it happens. So their expectation of Jesus coming in and freeing them from the oppression of Rome is pretty consistent. Like it makes sense that they would assume that this is how it's going to be. And it's fascinating because, hindsight is 20/20, right? You're like, oh, cool. And yeah, the accounts of Jesus in the Gospels is Jesus is very adamant on it's not people. The adversary isn't people. The adversary is sin. And Jesus is always consistent in this, right? And the weight of that, the amount of people that are there, I don't want to say it's a mob. It's not a mob till the end of the week. But also conversely as well, you have a religious system. You have the teachers of the religious law who have also pandered to creating a narrative that is misguided and untrue. And so I'm saying we shouldn't it doesn't exist in a vacuum or really gross paintbrush of everybody's terrible and wrong and they misinterpreted. But Jesus is also very direct in some places in the Gospels where he's telling them you are teaching wrongly. And so there is an accountability here on people who are in power of their own people, have kind of sold their own people over into the oppressor and are taking advantage of people, which Jesus is also very upset about, right? And so there's a lot of different things at play, like you're saying, that aren't... sometimes I've heard this before. We just we talk about how bad Rome is, or we talk about how bad the people of Jesus's day were. And it's kind of all of this stuff together is just everybody doesn't get it. And so Jesus comes in and this might sound really odd, but I've always envisioned that when Jesus is coming in on the colt, he's not happy. Right? We call it the triumphal entry because that's the way I think, like you're saying, it would have been kind of historically understood or how it's going as it's going down. Everybody's like, oh my gosh, you're going to save us.
Right.
And he's like, oh, you don't get it. And what I have to go do is not, it's like, oh, yay. It's not what they're anticipating or expecting. And Jesus knows what's coming to. So it's tough.
Yeah. I've heard some people say that it was triumphal in an ironic kind of way. Because it wasn't going to be what they expected.
Yeah, I've heard some things too that like logically they don't always add up. But one of the things, something that always resonated with me theologically that I heard was, Jesus is doing his ministry with the disciples, and then like there's this turn that Jesus makes, where Jesus starts to walk to Jerusalem with the group into the Passover and like into this. And I heard a pastor one time explain that as in like every step is towards death. I was like, man, that's tough. like, I mean, like, I want to go. And so the heaviness of this when he gets there, and even for me, this magnifies as we go more through our topic today on Holy Week of what Jesus decides to do, what we're left with in the scriptures of like how Jesus behaves and what he does. In that context of all of these things we're talking about happening and like that even, it's so powerful and good and challenging, how intentional all this is and how it's just neat. Like, man, just sitting outside there and hearing everybody just excited and elated and just like, you don't get it. You don't get it. This isn't.
Well, and if we try to put ourselves in the story and say we would have gotten it right, we would not have. Those people in the crowd represent us.
Man, I wouldn't have followed Jesus. I would have gone to Jesus and been like, "Hey, Jesus, what should I do here?" And Jesus would have been like, "I'm going to tell you a story. There's two people in it. One of them is the best person that's ever lived. The other's the worst. Which one are you?" And be like, "Bro, I just tell me what to do. I don't need like." Just get to the point. Tell me what the rule is or whatever I'm supposed to do. I would have been always annoyed.
Yeah.
I was so annoyed. Stop speaking in riddles. But I'm not saying Jesus always spoke in riddles, but yeah, so the triumphal entry, I think you did a great job describing like the weight of that. If you're the Romans, right, you're outnumbered 1-5. And you're and it's not Jerusalem. And this is something else to point out is Jerusalem isn't large, right? It's not like a big place. So when you're talking about, there's normally like, what do we say? You said 20,000, 40,000?
No, it's 40.
And it went to maybe 200. Like that city's not built for 200,000 people, right? I thought that's a lot of people. They're all like it's, and so I heard an analogy one time. It's like a powder keg.
Yeah.
Right. Like if and this also explains like some of the disciples' actions and behaviors too, of like, if you're going to do it, this is the time, because, you outnumber them and you can like, it's like, okay, we're going and people are ready and they want it and they're galvanized, right? That's a good word here. Like, they're galvanized in a singular purpose where if you went like, hey, we're going to overthrow Rome now. I mean, maybe they're on board. We're not all scattered. We're here together and everybody's feeling the vibe of like, we were freed of Egypt, and the Romans are like the Egyptians. Get them, and so it's neat how that's the energy. And then Jesus is like, nah.
Yeah, but the people who were thinking that it was going to be militarily, I mean, it didn't happen that way in Egypt. It wasn't a military victory in Egypt that released them.
Also true.
But to be fair, the thought around the Messiah was that the Messiah would be a military leader. And that had been for centuries been the thought.
Yeah, and just to make clarification in case I misspoke too, I'm referring to like Samson, some of these other judges and some of the prophets, right? Like, and to something else we kind of touched on too is you have an institution. Maybe that's not the right word, but you have a system in place that has kind of adulterated that truth and has used it for its own nefarious purposes. And so even the people of that day, it's not just that, like, it's not hard to make the connection of like, Moses didn't do it this way, but Samson did. And you have these people who are making money off of the regular people and taking advantage of them. And, you know, Jesus flips all the tables and turned my father's house into a house of thieves. And so there is a system in place that is interested in oppressing the already oppressed people to take advantage of them. And they're teaching things and perverting truth to keep them there. And they're getting it from all angles. So to your point too, like, I've never been in a situation in my life where I've been anywhere near that type of oppression. And I've been holding out on hope that it would be better for me and my family. And so the idea that Jesus comes in on the colt, and remember, y'all, Jesus has a reputation. People know who he is, even if they haven't met him. And then stories kind of like always can change narrative. So there's probably a lot of people who never met Jesus who are assuming all these things about his person that are not even remotely close to being true. And so he comes in on Passover. And it's like, who's going to free us? Because that's what he said he was going to do. And so, of course, that's going to be larger than life and all this other stuff. And so we move into Jesus comes in on the triumphal entry. The same time Pontius Pilate comes in on the other side to make sure y'all know who's in charge.
And so that was a normal kind of occurrence.
Yes.
Whenever the festival of Passover, or really any of the festivals, they'd always increase the number of troops. And Pontius Pilate was the governor of Judea at the time, and so he was the one leading those troops into the city. And so that too was part of the normal pattern of Passover week, and really of all the festivals.
Right. Yeah, you were saying this on Sunday too, how whoever the sitting governor was would come in for the festivals or the feasts, and whenever this kind of stuff was going to go down,
show of force.
They would come in as a show of force to remind people, like, "Hey, don't start nothing." Well,
exactly,
because we'll shut it down. And
it was part of the intimidation.
You know, I asked you this question too, and I would love somebody who's watching this who knows the answer to this. I if there is one, because I love context, and I assume things, or my brain goes into weird places, but I've also wondered like how long Pontius Pilate was in charge and how many times he had done this at Passover too. Because that, I don't know why, and maybe it doesn't mean anything, but to me it would be fascinating of like, you know, is this one different? Is he alone? It's just another Passover, guys, like suit up. We're going to go in there. We'll crush it if we need to. It's fine. Then all of a sudden Jesus is there and it's like, whoa, you know, because we do have the account as Jesus and Pontius Pilate interacting later in the week, and Pontius Pilate's like, this is different.
and you know, I think that's a question that we can look up the answer to. I mean, we know we'll have approximate dates when Pilate kind of ruled.
Yeah, sure, that whole interaction for me is kind of fascinating too. But anyway, so Maundy Thursday. So timeline wise, Dave, where is this the timeline in the week, and how does this kind of?
Well, so Palm Sunday happens at the beginning Sunday.
Okay, Sunday. Palm Sunday is on Sunday. Got it.
So the triumphal entry happens on the Sunday. Of course, the Sabbath at the time was Saturday, so that nothing would have happened on Saturday.
Yep.
So Sunday comes, Jesus comes into town. He spends roughly Monday through Wednesday in the temple teaching, and there's stories.
And hitting people with a whip.
Well, all of that. So there's stories of what he taught in there, and it's always interesting to, you know, read those in context of an occupied people. And maybe a religious kind of practices that have gone wrong or got twisted, got corrupted.
100%.
For sure. And then Thursday comes along. Maundy Thursday. And the way I read that story, so it's the Maundy Thursday is when Jesus brings his disciples together in the upper room. And they have the Last Supper together. We call it Holy Communion. And I really read that story as Jesus knowing that this is going to be the last time until he's killed, that he's going to be able to have a meal with his disciples. And so in the course of that meal, he really tries to emphasize, maybe even tie a bow on, what he'd been teaching them, for the last 3 years
Right.
about his purpose and about why he'd come, and try to. He tells them that he's going to die, and they don't really hear that. They don't really comprehend that, and maybe freak out a little bit about it.
just a little,
But
a little.
and Jesus tries to comfort them
Mm-hmm.
in that, because he knows who he is. He knows he's their leader. They've seen him as the Messiah, friend. That's probably one of the major kind of relationships that are there. But he tries to say, I have to do this, but I will always be with you. And whenever you celebrate this meal, I will be present with you. And in these symbols, in the bread, you'll remember my body that's broken for you. In this cup, you'll remember my blood that's been shed for you. You will remember all of my teachings. Kind of my lifeblood is here in this cup. And so he gives them that comforting reminder of who he is, and that he will continue to be that person. And so that is where we get our practice of Holy Communion today, and we can still make that claim that Christ is still here today. And so that's the beauty of Holy Communion, and really what happens on Maundy Thursday.
Right. Yeah, I love and there's other parts of the accounts depending on which gospel you're in, right? There's the interaction with Judas, and that's not a podcast we're going to get into this week because I've got some thoughts on that. But even Peter,
each of these things that we're talking about are huge ideas. And
they're big things.
Any kind of sentence almost in this Holy Week in the Holy Week scriptures could be fodder for a whole podcast on their own.
Yeah, and even with Peter, the very direct response of like, wherever you go, Lord, I will go. And Jesus is like, the cup that I'm about to drink, you cannot. And another thing that's really fascinating to me about that interaction is I think that's the first time since they've all been together that Jesus has told them where he's going, they cannot follow. And for me, even just the weight of that, it's like, we're just having a meal, man. Like, it's Passover. We're celebrating, right? Like, and I shared with this with you earlier, and I was saying, like, I don't think that Jesus is his normal, like, yay, like jovial. I know he wants to eat with them and stuff, but there's some assumptions I'm making where I don't, I believe that Jesus was a person that people liked to be around, and he loved life, and he loved people, and enjoyed people, right? And this is not a week where he's like his normal, like, yay type of self. I think he's a little bit more, he's weeping as they're coming into Jerusalem, right? Like, that's not he's crying a little. I mean, like, he's like weeping. And so for me, even to like, if we're in that room with him and listening to this, and Jesus is like, no, where I'm about to go, you can't come. And it's like, whoa. But you're the only one who believed in us. The rest of society, like, told us we were average and normal, and we were not capable of the great things that you've instilled in us. I mean, you know this, and I know this. And when you read the Gospels, like, from the jump, Jesus is like, no, go over there and do it, and then come back and let me know how it went. And I'm like, I don't trust anybody with anything. Like, what is that? And so, and it's just this, he's intentional about what he's teaching them and how he's talking to them, and then the washing the feet and the love each other as I have loved you. Every time you do this, remember me, and remember I'm with you till the end of the age, right? Like, all this stuff. And just the weight of that. And to me, the other, because we have the context of what happens next, my own hat, right? My own take. When we're faced with very difficult circumstance or permanence, right? Jesus knows what's about to come. To me, it's important for me to pay attention to how Jesus spends those moments. That this would be the last time he would be with them. He loves these people. He cares about them. They're not strangers to him. They're close. and he chooses to do these specific things, I think are also really important.
So the things that he did were comforting, for them, but then also the symbolism. This is happening during the Passover meal. He would become the Passover lamb. He would become this is all feeding into the reasons why he's having to do this. And then at the same time, that comfort of saying, but this is for you. This is for, all the world. This is the work my Father, Jesus said, has given me to do. But then but then he also says, and I've earnestly desired to eat this meal with you. So Jesus kind of realizes all of that stuff going on. The disciples don't. But what we're left with is this meal and this meaning that Jesus kind of put together for them, but then also for us and for every Christian that's come along since that time.
Right. And so then we move into Good Friday. Right. So Mount of Olives, Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus is taken. Well, Jesus is betrayed. Then Jesus is taken in the garden. Peter, is it Peter? Yeah, Peter takes the ear off the guard because they got swords. And Jesus is like, those who, I like to think that when Jesus does that, he's like staring daggers into Peter. He's like, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And he just maybe he's a little bit more intimate with the guard that he heals, but part of me is like, are you freaking kidding me, guy? Like, really? Just, like a dad when your kid misbehaves and you got to give him the look, right? And then he's taken from them. And they take him in the secret of night. It's gross. They try him at night. It's gross. And then they just do horrible stuff to him. And then, he gets passed over to the Romans. And then they make all the things and
all the theater. I mean, there's lots of theater.
Yeah, and it's and then even the disciples, right? Like, I think it wasn't that following Jesus in the other parts of the Gospels was safe, right? Because there's times where people were like, they pick up stones, getting ready to so there was some danger, but this is different, right? And now it's like, oh, if you're associated with Christ, like you're guilty of the same stuff. And it's like, oh, okay. And it all happens to me, like in my perspective, at least, it's all so fast. You went from having a great meal with Jesus where he was super excited, speaking his normal cryptic stuff that you're like, it'll make sense later because that's how it works, right? Because Jesus would constantly say these things. They'd be like, teacher, what do you mean? And he was like, all right, this. And they'd be like, oh. And now it's like, they're like, well, it'll make sense, right? And then he's not there anymore. And people are doing horrible stuff to him. And being associated with Christ now so it's no longer about outnumbering the Romans anymore. It's like you've got 200,000 people who don't like you. And your teacher has committed heresy. And they're going to kill him. And they're looking for anybody who's connected to that. I'm like, man, that's a fear I've never felt before.
No, you're right.
Right? So then they go through that, and then I was joking about Pontius Pilate and I have the power to set you free. Man, what I would give to be that guard who's like just got to stand there against the wall while they're talking and not like look, and to hear Jesus go, the only power you have is the power that God has given you. And I'm like, can you imagine like just sitting there being like, dude, they like messed this guy up. Like, what? He's not begging for his life. He's not trying to get out of it. He's like, nah, I'm going to do this because I'm choosing to. And Pontius, like, I can't imagine him like walking out because he walks out a second time, right? He goes to the crowd and he tries to get them to like let him go. And then they're like, they get more rowdy. And he goes back a second time, and then this whole conversation, I think, happens. And then Jesus is like, no. And then one of the hardest things for me is like Barabbas. And so the mob cries for Barabbas. And to keep this a little bit more child-friendly, Barabbas has done some really, really bad things to people. Convicted, just should not be in public, right? And the crowd screams for Barabbas, and I'm like, man. So anyway, so then that all goes down. Then they sentence him, and he's got to carry the cross up till Golgotha. And that whole thing is just also brutal, right? And then we get to the crucifixion, and Jesus is still ministering to everybody. You know, he's like, he takes care of his mom. That's another dynamic that just like absolutely destroys me, of what that was like for Mary. Because, you know, Joseph is the greatest man who's ever lived, because, you know, he's like in the Bible for like half a page, and he just does what he needs to do. And then there's no problems. I'm like,
never gets mentioned again.
Never gets mentioned again, right? And so we know that like Jesus leaving creates problems for Mary in the society, and Jesus makes sure that she's looked after. And then he ministers to the thieves. And it's just a tough day. That's just a tough day. And this is why we do Holy Week, right? Like and we do Lent is, I think that, you know, when we talked, you mentioned communion, we talked about communion. So for the uninitiated, so I'm a licensed local pastor. Dave is an elder, cause he's smart. I love doing that to you. And so, we have like a yearly accountability meeting. We meet with a committee, that, asks us about our calling and how we're discerning through that. Right. And so for me, one of the things that has been a part of my story, of why I feel called to ministry, and being a pastor, is communion. And, you know, so when we do communion once a month here at St. Matthew's, and when we're doing communion, I'm thinking about the context of this week, right? I'm thinking what we're talking about, what we're doing in remembrance of. It's that Jesus is like in his last moments of ministry to those people that he loves and cares for so much. He's going, remember me and love each other well. And it's in the context of oppressed people, right? And that's why we do communion. It's now, granted, little kids like come up and they're like, "Hey, can I get some more bread?" I'm like, "Sure, here, I have all the bread. Like, get in there, like do the things, right?" But it is this is what we're doing, right? And making sure that people understand, like, that's the context in which communion is done and why is important to me. You know, and there's something else. Like, this is a total rabbit trail here, but you did. You said something about oppressed people. I believe you said oppressed. No, what did you say? Occupied. There's oppressed, occupied. It begins with an O and ends in a D.
I probably said both
said
words.
Said both.
So whatever.
They both work in the context. But in that, right? We are. Now, we're not oppressed in the political sense, right? That they were walking around in that day. But the oppressor and that Jesus is talking about is the oppressor of sin. And this is what, as Christians, this is what we acknowledge is like, it's not the principalities of people, right? You're not my enemy, right?
Right.
It's sin. Sin is the problem, and we can't fix it on our own. And Jesus, I think, is making this case. He's like, no, listen, like, the problem is not the Romans. The problem is not the religious leaders and rulers of your day. Now, granted, like, they're accountable for their decisions and taking advantage of people, sure, but Jesus is here to combat and eradicate sin.
Well, and that's the message of the cross, is that that forgiveness is real, and that anything that keeps us from a relationship with God or with our neighbor died with Jesus. That was the purpose of the cross, is that forgiveness that keeps us from those relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And really, when we deny that today, when we deny that forgiveness, we're saying that Jesus didn't do enough.
Yeah.
Which is hard to think about. But that was the purpose of the cross, was to make that relationship viable, to make it possible, even in the midst of all of our kind of wrongdoings, all of our sin, all of the ways that we have missed the mark. The cross kind of erases that stuff.
Yeah, and I, something I say to Dave a lot, mainly because I need to hear it, and sometimes I say things so that Dave can be like, "Mm-hmm, you need to hear that." So I use a phrase, and I say, if you want the right answers, you have to ask the right questions. And so one of the things that I always struggle with Holy Week is, and this is not a jab at anybody, this isn't meant to be negative, but we see a lot of people on Palm Sunday, and we see a lot of people on Easter, and Maundy Thursday and Good Friday are and I understand that. I get that, because the heaviness of that, and for me, one of the things that's really important about going through Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday as well, and asking good questions in community with people who love you, is that part of the way you answer the questions that those days provoke in you is how you're going to understand Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so a theme that is really important to me, and we've been talking about Holy Week, we talked about Lent, but today we're parking on Palm Sunday, Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, is Jesus is doing this on purpose. Right? There's a choice that Jesus makes here, and is choosing to do it. And for me, like growing up, my understanding of Good Friday was, well, I'm terrible and I'm bad, and the reason Jesus died is because I'm a sinner, and all the things. And, I grew up where we couldn't eat meat on Fridays, and I was like, what do you mean I can't have pepperoni on my pizza? But anyway, and I'm not saying that isn't true to some extent, but Good Friday is also to get Jesus into focus. It's not me. It's Jesus going, no. I know this is the cost. I know what's coming. I know what's going to happen and how this is going to feel. And I'm choosing it because I want to. Mm-hmm. That's hard for me. Mm-hmm. It's a hard thing to sit in. It's a hard thing to go into Friday and sit in the sanctuary like we're gonna, and like hear that and go, we're not at Easter. like Jesus literally dies, and we're gonna sit in that for a minute. Mm-hmm. And yet, if we do that in the ways that I think Jesus is trying to encourage us to, it's hard and it hurts and it's tough. But the payoff of that, the thing we gain access to, the hope we receive, the faith we receive, and the restoration we get, and having a relationship with God, is awesome. And it's good. But Jesus doesn't die in spite of people. Jesus dies on purpose. And I didn't hear that a lot. So for what it's worth, if that's something you're working through, anyway.
Well, he chose to do that for us. Mm-hmm. And somehow it makes a difference. Right. And somehow that relationship that we can have with God is what fills us and what gives us life. And so that's why this is one of the central kind of days of the year for us, and weeks of the year for us. Mm-hmm. And those folks that come on, Palm Sunday and Easter and miss the story in between, you're missing something. You're missing something big there. It's not comfortable. It's really not comfortable. Kind of in the church world, whenever we're designing worship, we always end the worship service on a note of hope and blessing. The Good Friday service, when it's done the way it's supposed to be done, it ends without that hope. And for those church people who are used to ending the service each week on that note of hope, to have it not be there on Friday of Holy Week, I think helps us to get in the position of all of those disciples and followers and people who love Jesus, in that when he died, they didn't have that hope. That hope had died with them. And so by that one simple kind of way that we design our worship services for Good Friday, it really puts us into that place. And then, not that we're going to talk about Easter today, but
Yeah.
and then Easter is kind of more glorious when you've been in the darkness, and means more.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you've been in the absence and experienced the absence of hope, having that hope restored, you know, the word is glorious. I mean, it's the, you know, how do you describe that? So it's the whole package is meaningful. The whole calendar there is meaningful.
We and now I know why I'm doing Good Friday. Thanks, Dave. Just messing with you.
And Easter.
You know, to be fair, Dave asked me what I wanted to do, and I said Good Friday, and he was like, "Okay." We were playing this months ago, but I think you make there's a point or something you're touching on there too, of like that. You know, it makes it going into that and then coming out into Easter, right? It means so much. And so one of the things I'm always fascinated with is, you know, when we talk about the gospel, right? It's almost like saying, well, I love something, right? And like there's different levels of that, right? Like those means different things. But like when we're talking about the gospel, like I'm not, you know, Easter we're Easter people, for crying out loud. Like Easter's like the thing, right? But the whole picture in Holy Week, it's like we get the entire thing. We get the gospel, like the wholeness of the gospel is in the way that Holy Week kind of plays out. And for me, like the thing that changed my life isn't, you know, I'm not downplaying that Jesus raises from the, like, yes, but that Jesus chooses me amidst the devastation that's coming. That's what changed me. Mm-hmm. Because I didn't have a life where like that had clicked anywhere else. And I was like, oh, I matter to God. God loves me. And when you sit in that, it's uncomfortable. It's weird. I don't like it. I still don't like doing it, right? And I'm clergy, for crying out loud. But like, when you have a God who's like, I love you, and I'm going to get you. I'm coming to get you. And I want to have a relationship with you. And I'm willing to do this. Mm-hmm. And you sit in that for a minute. That, to me, it's not, it's trivial to say, like, that's the good stuff. But that changes lives. Because for me, part of the rhythm and flow, right, or the of being a Christian is there will be times, I think, at least for people, where it feels like hope died. Mm-hmm. You're going to go through like the valleys of life, and this is tough. I'm like, God, like, you love me, right? Like, and when you sit in that, it's like, oh, that's right.
Yeah, I think in following the pattern of Holy Week and of the Christian calendar, and experiencing Good Friday, you know, in this special week of the year, whenever you experience a Good Friday through the death of a loved one or some other traumatic or loss of a job or anything that goes on in your life that's hard to deal with, I think you're somehow more equipped to deal with that if you live through these patterns that are set up in the Christian calendar, in the Christian year.
Yeah,
I mean, they, in a way, they simulate life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the going through those hardships. If you've gone through Good Friday and have learned to be expectant of Easter morning, then whenever you're going through, you know, those hardships in your life, you can expect Christ to still be with you even in that darkest day.
And Jesus is willing to sit with you in that darkness to help you understand that Jesus hasn't abandoned us and left us. And for me, that's a tough thing, because it's to do like we talked about with Lent, right? Like to do that internal work where I'm like, oh God, I failed you. And sometimes like I can go to God and be like, hey, I messed that up, but I didn't mean to. And God's like, yeah. And then there's other times where I'm like, oh no, I like totally picked the wrong thing on purpose. Uh-oh. like, right. But in that, right, like that's Jesus's response to our sin, to my sin is no. I'm coming to get you. Like I didn't abandon you. Like that hasn't, I'm still making a way for us because I want to, because I want you. Like, again, I keep circling this point is like, that's so encouraging to me once I get through the uncomfortability of that.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, we're loved. Oh, we matter. And even the questions of deservedness or undeservedness, sometimes, for the most part, that kind of fades into the distance for me because that's not, Jesus doesn't really address that. It's like, I'm going to do it because I want to, because I have, because you can't do it for yourself, so I choose to do it. And I'm like, wow, so if you're going to choose to do that, what will you not do? Right? And then as Easter people, we're not going to talk about Easter, but when, as a believer, if we sit in that and I'm not comfortable, but if we learn how to like navigate that with Christ, what can we not do for kingdom purposes? What can we not, like, who, it's the old adage, right, of like, who is beyond redemption? And if we hold on to those concepts, like no one is beyond redemption. We've all been called to make a difference for the kingdom and to love our neighbor, and through the relationship and the empowerment of God and the Holy Spirit and the way that Jesus has made for us, we are then inheritors of that and that relationship. And then we get to go be a fruitful difference, and we're all called to it. And so those feelings of despair we've had in the seasons where it's like, oh my gosh, we've given over into despair. It looks really bad or it's tough. We get to hold on to that. Like, that's right. Jesus isn't done. But again, back to Good Friday, too much hope. But back to Good Friday, sitting in that moment, there was none. Like he died and he was dead.
That's what died means.
Yeah. And I just like, I can't even fathom that. I'm a dad now and a husband. And so like, I have no context as to like somebody being taken from me that I love and that I care about, and I hang on their word. And I believe, and I've devoted my life now to their teaching, and they're taken from me, mutilated, tortured, and then ridiculed, and like, just like, it's just terrible. And then the bad guys win for story purposes, right? The bad guys win. I'm like, man, that's awful. And by the way, now we're all in danger because we're next. That's Good Friday, right? So anyway, so, come the Holy Week, if you want to hear more of that, and we'll also see Sunday. But I care so much about these concepts and what we're talking about, because what you have access to when you sit through these things, I think, is so powerful and so good. But you gotta go through that.
Yeah,
we gotta go through that to get to the other part.
And then we have to do it again next year.
Or every time we do communion.
Yeah.
Kelly, you mean every time we do communion, it's going to be this awful, brutal thing? You're going to be like, remember, Jesus died and hope was dead. No, but yes.
And this cup represents his blood. Yes.
Like, last thought. Let's end on a humorous note here. I'm gonna submit this. Like, I wonder what Peter's eyes looked like when Jesus is like, I will have to drink this cup of wrath and you cannot drink it. And Peter's like, what are you even talking about? Cup of wrath? Like, but you're a good person, Jesus. Like, what are you talking? Like, that's another one of the many moments that I wish I could have been there, being like, just staring at Peter, like looking for his reaction. No, Jesus, wherever you go, I'll follow. And he's like, listen, that had to be intense.
lots of intense moments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about you? Closing thoughts?
Closing thoughts. You know, I describe Holy Week to people in the church as our Super Bowl. It's the pinnacle of the year. We as clergy, we kind of do everything. We pour ourselves out this week. We gather all of the resources of the church. We hold these worship services to try to help folks walk through this time. And it really is the most important, holiest of weeks of the year.
Yeah.
And so I hope that you participate, if not at St. Matthew's, then somewhere else, but that you participate and that you learn to walk with Christ. Walk with him, on Palm Sunday in the triumphal entry. Walk with him on Maundy Thursday at the Last Supper, Good Friday at Golgotha, and then on Sunday morning at the empty tomb. And as you do that, you grow, and you begin to understand honestly the life that Jesus offers, and that it's meant for you, no matter who you are or where you are. It's meant for you, and I hope that you will, accept the gift that he offers to all.
Amen, brother.
Amen.
I'm Pastor Kelly.
And I'm Pastor Dave.
And we'll see you next week to talk about Easter.
It'll
the
be
hope,
Easter week.
The hope stuff.
Yes,
The
yes.
good stuff. We'll see you on the next one.
Bye-bye.
Bye.